So in this video, we're going to talk about feedback. You've potentially heard that term oftentimes with a musical reference, right? If you're out, jamming on your guitars, playing in your garage band, if the sound that you're creating is being picked up by the microphones, being amplified by the speakers, and being picked up by the microphones again, we get this, what we call feedback loop, and you hear this screeching sound, right? And you always hear as a band's warming up or something, and they have to adjust some of their audio. Here we're going to be talking about feedback in the sense of climate, or at least in the sense of Earth system, right? Which, climate is a big part of that, like a subsystem of that. Feedback, in our context, is going to come in two forms, positive. It's going to come in two forms, positive and negative feedback. A good definition of feedback is something within a system that can modify what the forcing on that system is, right? So if you put a force into a system, like a sound wave, whatever that force is put into, the feedback can either make that noise louder, change the pitch, make it softer. It can either positively, so it can increase that forcing, or it can dampen or decrease that forcing. So a good way to summarize positive and negative feedback: if a forcing or a force happens to a system, the feedback in a positive feedback system will increase that force. It will make that force stronger, which then kind of starts to tumble down the hill, right? A positive feedback loop. It gets stronger and stronger and stronger. A negative feedback loop is when the forcing happens on the system, the feedback dampens or kind of shuts down that signal. The forcing, as it's hitting the system, as it's modifying the system, is being lessened, which is kind of this like death spiral, right? It's like kind of cutting itself off, or its own action of forcing is shutting the system down. In our climate context, there's a lot of feedback loops. We're not going to be able to get into all of them, but I did want to kind of talk about how they work, at least, and use a few examples. So the forcings on Earth system for our feedback loops are incoming solar radiation, that's an incoming force; greenhouse gas concentration, which again, code word for CO2, and aerosols. Aerosols is the particulate, the solid bits and pieces that are in the atmosphere. Wildfire smoke or something like that would be considered aerosol, or exhaust from your neighbor's diesel truck. The feedback mechanisms, we talked about the forcings, the feedback mechanisms in the kind of climate realm, or at least in our context, are clouds, which, depending on the amount of clouds you have, energy will get reflected back to space. So the more clouds you have, the less energy you have into the system. So precipitation, with increased precipitation, you have generally increased plant growth. Photosynthesis is a process by which CO2 is stripped out of the atmosphere and contained in plants. So with more plant growth tied to precipitation, we have CO2 being pulled out of the atmosphere. The greening of forests, again, this is similar to the last one. Plant growth strips CO2 out. But what that makes us think about is not just precipitation, but seasonality, right? So plants are growing really strongly during part of the year and not so much during other parts of the year. Most of Earth's land masses are up in the northern hemisphere. So when we look at CO2 cycles, we see this seasonality, kind of like a sine wave. And then another big one is actually ice. So when solar radiation hits Earth, if it hits ice, it has a really high, what we call albedo. And albedo is the reflectivity of something. And ice has an albedo of about 90%, meaning it reflects back about 90% of the incoming solar radiation. So depending on how these things are changing, the Earth's system is absorbing different amounts of radiation. So the easiest way to kind of think about one of the positive feedback loops is actually ice. So if we imagine solar radiation is coming in and hitting the ground in one of the polar areas, let's pick on the Arctic Ocean. So there's lots of ice, sea ice, that covers the water. That radiation comes in and actually bounces off and heads back up into space. And that is kind of how it works. But as that ice is reduced, then that energy is now hitting water, which to sunlight, water is basically black, right? Like wearing a black t-shirt on a hot summer day. And so that then begins to absorb more radiation. Now that causes warming, right? But the warming then causes the ice to melt more quickly. And as the ice is melting more quickly, more kind of open sea is exposed, which absorbs more radiation. And so you can see that's an example of a positive feedback loop kind of tumbling along. What I hope you kind of come away with this little discussion of feedback is that it's a precarious system. And there's no one closed system where we just have one feedback loop. In the previous example, we talked about how warming could increase the rate at which the ice is melting. And that's true in its own realm, but warming can cause changes in levels of precipitation in other parts of the Earth, right? So we could get increased precipitation in certain areas, so we would get more greening. It can affect the distribution of clouds and the amount of clouds. So all of it is actually tied together in this really complicated network, although at least for discussion purposes, it's simple to pull out one kind of individual feedback loop and think about that. But they're all kind of tied together in a very messy way. You guys are going to see another video that has to do with feedback loops. It's largely tied to the animal kingdom, talks about predation and prey. But hopefully that will kind of further allow you to understand what we're talking about when we mean positive versus negative feedback loops, and how a forcing, right? So in this case, solar radiation, the force on the system, as it interacts with various parts of that system, those feedbacks, they can either increase or decrease the effect of that forcing. So feedback loops in a nutshell.